I want to give you a little bit of context on what busuu does so that you can understand a bit of the examples that I'm going to be talking about. It's about long tails understood in a very loose way, as in like it's not just in the analytical sense, it's also about the processes that we followed and the way we think about them. And so basically, just to start off, busuu is a learning language platform, live in different platforms and in different ways. And we aim to break down the language barriers through that. So as you can see, we are in the App Store, on the Android Store, and finally also on web, on desktop, and you can also use the web version on your iPhones and your Android phones. And then once you sign in, you can have the free version, which has limited amount of features, or the premium version, which you have. Then you are entitled to many more features, and then there's different plans depending on the length that you want to be learning the language and so on. So that gets complicated when you get to the premium section. And I just want to say that because then here it's when the long tail starts, because it's when the analysis becomes a little bit more complicated. So basically, and as a definition of that, you can see long tails in many different distributions. So probably when you think of the first distribution that comes to mind, it's probably the Gaussian distribution or the normal distribution, where you have a central part, which is where you can say that there's a probability that something will happen with a certain degree of confidence. Then you have the margins, where you start being less sure about what will happen. And then finally, this red part, which is the long tail, where you know that there's a possibility that that will happen, but it's not a reassurance. And what happens with that is that depending on what you're measuring, sometimes you have a lot of individual items or entities on the x-axis that alone don't account for much across the whole measure that you're trying to measure actually. But when you put all of them together, then that becomes a significant amount of volume that you're not accounting on individually. And we call fat tails when this red part becomes very much larger, and then the Y percentage becomes significant. There's usually the saying that the 80-20, so 80% of the revenue comes from the 20 items or entities and vice versa, but that can change, and it depends really on what you're analyzing, that you need to take into account this comparison between the X and the Y. And well, you have probably heard of the less is more. Well, this is by Mies van der Rohe, an architect that basically preached simplicity. This is just the opposite. So you become in a much more complex world when you start analyzing those long tails, and actually the problem comes when you want to manage them and you want to get insights from them. So this is basically what you're juggling with, right? So when you have all these entities, you want to prioritize to know what should I focus on. And usually the easy part is, okay, I'm going to focus on the head parts because it's what it brings revenue and it's where I'm most successful on. But then there's the idea of, oh, we'll put all my eggs in one basket, and if that fails or if that feature fails, then I will end up with nothing. In which case you want to see if your product is succeeding in that long tail, so that you can specifically target that and tailor your user experience or your product or what you're offering. And then the other part, which is a pain for the analyst, is how you forecast that little part there, because it's a significant amount and it's very individual. But you know very little about them individually, so it's very difficult to forecast in that. And all of that compounds in the strategy that you're going to follow across teams. So both from acquisition standpoints, product, engineering teams, and so on. So it's a bit of a balance with the classical financial terms of revenue versus cost. So the revenue of maximizing the return on one specific feature versus the cost of maintaining the whole long tail of the other entities. And everything in life is about balance. So you clearly cannot just forget that long tail doesn't exist. So what I'm going to do is explain 3 examples where I've come across these kind of long tails. The first one is very classical, when you look at analyzing country data, and you have a lot of different countries with different values on revenue. The other one is when you actually think about that long tail, about collecting the data from different sources and how you track things. And the third one is where I reverse that logic and I move to alerting, and it's where you want to focus on the long tails instead of just focusing on the head, and you actually want to just know about the long tail. So this is data from busuu, and obviously it's anonymized, so please don't ask me the countries and the percentages, but it's a bit on a widespread and it's all data as well. So we had, back in the day, 2017, we had 66% of revenue coming from 9 countries, which are the green ones. And the product was tailored there. So all the strategies were very specific for those ones. And then 34% of the other revenue came from the other 186 countries that we were serving. Individually, here you cannot even see them because it's probably 0. But individually, they would amount for something, and it's at the end is money in the bank. We always want money in the bank. So usually, and that's a wide known strategies for long tails, and this is why it's a classical example. What you try to do is you try to see and group by behavior and strategy. So for example, you have, like in Pizza Hut, you have the 3 different models. So you try to group on how you do with them. And this way you know what you're managing, and you know your streamlines, and you know how they are behaving. So you can measure on those, you know how they are doing, and then you can, when you do A/B tests, you know what is better and what is worse. So what you do with this percentage here, with that percentage, you're trying to break, you try to put limits to it. So things like, okay, so what's the general behavior of it? What we have seen, the average order value, the maximum amount of revenue that they can bring, or the pricing strategies, or things like that that can kind of, you're looking at the black box, and you're looking at how it behaves without you knowing specifically what are the metrics of that big bubble. And you try to break it down by looking at then grouping inside that already big group. And that's what happened. So we have now 11 groups of countries. And we have reduced from the 34% to 27%. So it's already lower. It's already not accounting for 1/3 of the revenue. Still is huge. So what we do is as soon as, and the product will keep changing. So as you A/B test, or as you keep changing the product, you will start to see bubbles appear. Also because there's different teams that do things that you don't really are aware of. So there's certain teams that want to spend more in certain countries, and suddenly you realize that country is very reactive to certain kind of advertisement, and then you kind of understand how those countries work. And this is very high level, and this is how we kind of think about that. And applying these methods, which are, I think, a little bit, reasonable. I looked into the other example, which is not specifically long tail per se, in the sense of analytical long tail, but as I mentioned, we are in Android, we are in Apple, we are in web. So there's a lot of different data that comes from different places that means different things, and it's aggregated in different formats. And that's a nightmare, from the engineering perspective and from the analytical perspective. So these are the few of the sources that we have, but as you can say, there's many more, and it's both external integration or internal integration, as in like we want to get more data about events, or we want to get more data about, or we want to feed data to third party, like marketing or like product or other things. So that needs to be managed. So when you look at each piece of data individually, you have some limitations on all of them, and some strengths, which is balance again. There's overlapping between them, so you can have comparisons between them and kind of sense check what's happening. But the format is different, and I'm going to give some examples. But first, like the objective that we want to achieve is that we want to have a source of truth that we can trust and the ground is not moving under our feet. So if we say that the revenue is this much, is this much. If we say that this is the usage of the app, this is the usage of the app, not something else. And we discover that, I don't know, we were not tracking something that we should have been tracking. This didn't happen here. It happened in my previous company where we were missing a whole part of WeChat because we were not tracking, which I might talk about it later. And then finally, it's really important for the business if you want to grow, especially in the tech world, that you can have end-to-end user journeys so that you can build forecasting models and you can build data science models that are on solid ground and you're not being biased towards certain sources of data. So this is what we did for the country analysis, and this is how we thought about on the collecting data, on the side of collecting data. So in this case, you start by the big players, right? So you start breaking these chunks into the big ones. In this case is the App Store, obviously, because it's one of the platforms. So as we all know, the experience on using an app, it will be different on Android and on Apple. So that's pure logic. And you start seeing the different behaviors as well on all the different metrics. And then you try to bring the backend data, which is the one that you have to check against. You try to bring that data into the store's data. And that's because the store's data is the source of truth, is money in the bank, it's what it counts. So you pick one reference, you bring it back to that reference. Then you're still missing some parts for the other sources. And what you try to do is infer those properties based on proxy metrics. So in this case, for example, we know that in Brazil, there's a provider that we use to sell the plans, basically. And based on that, we can infer with the pricings that we're selling and the units that we're selling, we're inferring the plan. And when I mean plan, I mean, for example, there's users in Brazil that are paying 24 months plans or 12 months plans, et cetera, et cetera. And based on that, we can, without knowing the plan, we can infer what that is. And without having to add tracking, which puts a lot of restraint into other tech teams. And as you mentioned, it needs to be fast and quick. So the other thing, and that's a big one, the recurring versus the new mix. So how many new users land on your apps and on your websites and actually purchase a new plan, versus how many of those purchases that you're seeing and that this new revenue that is coming, it's actually recurring. The stores are not really clear sometimes on that. So you need to try to infer that based on clever, I would say, logics that you learn as you go. And then finally, with the release of new features, you can start separating the behavior of the users within the same platform. So you kind of understand why do people recur on certain places and why do people come new in different plans. For example, upgrades or downgrades or cancellations, that's how you infer those properties that you didn't have at the beginning. So these are two examples, and they are not real because I've modified them. So this is how it would look like a report from the App Store. You have aggregated data, you have 3 purchases for a certain price at a renewal rate for that title. That's lies. Because at that point in time, it says renewal, but actually that was a free trial. So we hadn't had a purchase yet, that's the first purchase. So we need to understand how this data works based on the backend data. The top one is aggregated, and then backend helps us disaggregate that data. But the way that we measure the different things might have discrepancies, and not selling, but there's a blog on one of our backend engineers at the bottom of that where it's how we thought about the server-to-server notifications and how we can build a backend that actually coincides with the App Store data. So in this case, the long tail was to reconcile both so that we know that we have the reference point and then we have the backend data that actually is non-aggregated data, and then in there we can build the forecast, and we can build the decision trees for the data science models and so on, which is what brings features back to the app and what brings value to the experience of learning a language with busuu. And then the other part, and to do that, we need to enrich this data, so the store gives very little to what we want. Doesn't give us where those users came from, who are they going to renew, or are they not going to renew? I don't know, there's a lot of data from those users that we don't have.
I'm really sorry, I just get confused. Do you mean by App Store the information that you get from App Store, or App Store as a app logs of tracking?
No, App Store means the reports that the store sent. In this case, Apple Store.
Okay.
Yeah, no problem. So that's pretty much what we try to do. As we know, at every point of decision, the behaviors will be different. So for example, if you start with a free trial or you start with a discount, the behavior of that user will be completely different. The store doesn't give us that data. It's the backend that needs to have that data, and then that we enrich that to get better sense of what decision should we make and how we should change the product. This is one, but then we have to do this with the Android store and with the web store, and then for each country and for everything else, which then this is why you tackle the big ones and then you try to just roll it up and bring backend up to speed. And then the last one, it's about alerting. So a bit of context on what I mean by alerting. We want systems that tell us when something is going wrong. And by that, I don't mean that a pipeline has failed and we don't have data. I mean, for example, registrations are completely down. Or, I don't know, revenue. We're having purchase events, but we have zero value for that. What's happening? We want that every time that happens, we are losing money. And we want that to be extremely reactive. The problem with that is that if we start tracking every single piece of the business model, we will end up with alerts that change a lot and fluctuate a lot, which means that the alarms will keep firing up and down, and we will not know what's happening. Or the opposite reaction, which is I will become blind to the alerts, I will not take care of the alerts, and I will say, okay, whatever, it's alerting, but as long as I can see that everything else is working and there's no fire around me, that's fine. Which then you get screamed at. So what's happening is that usually you classify alerts, right? You have the critical ones, which is everything is failing, you need to just wake up and start working on it. You have the warning ones, which is showing, well, there's a trend here, or there's your trespassed the level, just take care of that. And then there's the normal, or this is working nicely and smoothly. Those last ones, as I will show in the example, became a nightmare because you become blind to it, because you keep having alerts that everything is working normal. I already know that it's working normal, so I don't want those. And that becomes a long tail in the sense that they keep firing and they have very high frequency of firing, but there's actually not the alarm that I want to look at. I want to look at the ones that fire less, but that are much more critical, which are at the bottom of the long tail. This is how we classified. This is, by the way, this is not at busuu, this is at student.com where I worked before. So we had these metrics. We established the different alerts based on the different parts of the funnel. So we would have acquisition, which was mainly through Google Analytics and ranking on the web and SEO and all that stuff. Then we had activation, and activation actually meant that the users would land on the website, would inquire for a property, and would say, I want to book this property for, I don't know, this period of time. And finally, retention, in the sense that we would want to see that user returning and purchasing again with us instead of going directly to the landlord or to the hotel directly, and we would want them to come back to us because of offers or because of anything else. And finally, as always, revenue. That business model was based on percentage of commission that we would take from the different hotels or landlords. So depending on the deals that we would have with each of them, we would have different revenues. And that meant that, for example, if the hotel is fully booked for us, but still there are rooms, that revenue would be zero. So here you go. We would want to stop that revenue from happening. It's not an alarm in the sense that the product is broken. It's an alarm as in like the business model is failing. We need to get money in a different way. So each part of this funnel metrics has different properties. So for example, if you look at the acquisition, you don't care if you're, I don't know, if you have, I don't know what, so yeah, if you have been in the website, I don't know, 3 years ago, you just care if you have been searching for certain keywords during this period of time. You care about the device that you're using. You care as in like what's the version of that device. You care about what time of the day is it, because if you need some kind of customer service, that might not be the right time to call the hotel. And then in the activation, for example, you want to know, are you using Facebook? Are you using email? Are you using some providers? So for example, are you on PayPal, or are you in different systems? In retention, obviously, you want to know, have we seen you before? So there's different properties on each one of them that might not be relevant for the one from the one above. So you don't want to just do a table of all the properties versus all the metrics and then start alerting on all of those. And then finally, benchmarks. There's benchmarks that should be stable. So for example, we have made a purchase and the value is 0. That's a hard benchmark. But there's other things like moving benchmarks, which could be, for example, seasonality. So you're going on holidays, it's summer, and we want to have much more, and we're spending much more. So that minimum benchmark should go up. But if it's February, it's dark and gloomy, we know that no one is buying anything in terms of long stay accommodation, then that benchmark should not be as high and should be lower, because it's the normal behavior. So we need to first model how these benchmarks look like for each one of these combination of metrics and properties. So again, we take the same approach, but in this case, we're focusing on the alarms that we want to see and that we want to be alerted on instead of the main ones, because the main ones are not giving us that much value. So basically, we classify by priority and we find what metrics are the most relevant. In our case, the most relevant was the acquisition because it was the intent to buy, and then we had a sales team that would go and chase them, and CRM and all that stuff that we would try to convert. So the main thing was at that moment was growth. So we were going for acquisition. So at that moment, we decided that acquisition was the first alarming metric that we should monitor. We would treat the benchmarks as a black box. So we would see how were the different properties evolving across time, and then based on that, we would check how much was the frequency on when the alarm should fire. So we don't want an alarm firing every single time that there's someone hitting the website, because that would be terrible. We want alarms that give us, for example, the count of users that have visited the website in a specific country for a specific period of time. And then, based on that, and this is what I mentioned about WeChat, we spotted emerging sources of that were not tracked of users coming to the website. I don't know if you know WeChat, but WeChat is very popular in China, and it works completely different to Facebook or to any other acquisition method that we have, and it also used for logging in. So it would be kind of a Facebook where you have an authentication method, but at the same time you can advertise in there, which means that you can have acquisition through there. And we just had some people in the ground that were advertising without us knowing, and that started to grow, and we didn't know what was happening, and we had many more acquisition that we could not track, and this is what happened. So I will start by how we thought of it, and it was a nightmare. So we had, if you start by the acquisition, we had at that moment, we put WeChat, Facebook, Google, and email, as in like you could sign in to register or to create a lead through all these different methods. Then we had to check if it was an app or a web, because obviously if you cannot register through the web, but you can register through the app, it means that there's something wrong in the web area. And then we would check the source countries. That each line of this, each arrow of this, it's multiplied by the 200 countries. So that means that you start having alarms for every time that the country has a lower number. And obviously you start usually by when there's a drop rather than there's an increase. So for example, if you have an attack or spam that is just hitting your email endpoint, you will end up having a massive spike, and then the following one will be a drop. And because you're doing by historical, you will have an alarm. So that was as well kind of the new ways of tracking the alertings. And then finally, we would look at the destination city. So where are you going? Is the website for that destination city has enough properties that the user can check? Is it something that we are actually serving, or you just made up a keyword and then you found, I don't know, Glasgow with 2 W's? And what happened is that was not enough. Well, it was too much actually, so we changed from the country to the language interface, because this way we could reduce the amount of complexity to the system, and we could see actually, and it was actually a better way of measuring what was happening with the product, because the product is tailored for the usage rather than the country. And as Tom mentioned before, in localization teams, English is English. It's not English in India and English in UK. So you end up just having, instead of 2, you have 1, which is easier. And finally, we had to check the properties inquired, which is here's where the money is, and we could link to the following alarm, as like you would inquire for a property that is actually live and there's actually money behind that, rather than I'm just inquiring for anything because I'm desperate and I want to bet for tomorrow in, I don't know, London. So we would measure all of that. And so that's how we try to reduce the long tail and make sure that the ones that we're firing were the ones that we were interested in. I couldn't share with you the logs of the alerts, but basically every 5 minutes we would have something like 200 alerts when it was in that weird state of everything is firing. What happened was basically we were a team of 3. We never looked at that channel. We never looked at alarms. And it was usually the product team that would come 2 days later saying, hey, there were less people in this country, specific country. We were doing an A/B test. Did you see something weird? Well, we did, but we didn't look at it. So my final take on that is that the data analytics team usually need to have different kind of people within the team, or someone or yourself need to kind of learn different skills. And it's not only about the business model that you learn, it's also about what product skills do you have, what kind of A/B tests do you want to prioritize, how do you measure them. Some engineering skills, because you need to be scrappy and you need to start moving fast. And then obviously the analytical or mathematical skills or more statistical skills, so that you can know that something is meaningful. And that itself is a long tail.